I will do my best to keep you engaged, and you can ask any questions anytime that I'm talking about this issue. Okay. So let me just start and tell you. When I first came to Georgia in 1978, probably before many of you were born, and one of the things that struck me was. I guess it struck me because I was coming from the UK, from England in particular, where history was rarely a part of the conversation in the same way that it was in Georgia. And it struck me that Georgians were obsessively recalling their past. This was in the late 70s in Georgia. So history was everywhere around. It was in the ritual toasts of the KP, it was in the street statuary, it was in museums, it was in Bukinisti that I visited, it was on TV, it was in journals, it was in humor, of course, as well, which very often was the most subversive aspect for the Soviet Union at that time. This nostalgia for the past, of course, was not unusual. I had encountered it in the UK, not so much in England, but certainly in Northern Ireland, where the Catholics and the Protestants at this time in Northern Ireland were fighting over their own particular interpretations of history. And I'd also witnessed was witnessing at that time the campaign for secession by the Quebecois. They had their first referendum in 1980, where the past again and history was very much part of the struggle for the case that they were making about the independence of Quebec, or secession of Quebec. So the past, obviously, and this is not something new for you, is always a battleground because it's such a powerful instrument in establishing cultural hegemony and privilege. And in the Soviet Union, of course, and again, you probably don't remember this so much, but you no doubt have read about it, history was an incredibly important instrument of power and legitimacy. But at the same time, and this was the interesting part, particularly maybe in a place like Georgia, it was unable to stifle a parallel culture of private memories. And it was these private memories in the end that undermined the credibility of the Soviet state. So, in the Soviet period, historians, of course, were hampered by ideological constraints and by the conservative methodologies that they had access to. But there were some, like Pavel Ingoropva, Ivana Javakhishvili, Sergei Makalatia, Georgi Tedoradze, who did quite sophisticated studies of regional and local history in Georgia. But still, after those examples, 25 years after the collapse of the USSR, Georgian history and ethnography, it seems, is still burdened by these old Soviet ideas of the fixed ethnos and by the intellectual isolation produced by lack of resources and opportunities. So it's still a problem 1/4 of a century later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The discipline of oral history, in its approach and methods, is often a challenge to the official narrative, but it seems it has barely reached the shores of Georgia as yet. Other former communist countries like the Baltic states and Eastern European countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, have, it seems, made much more progress in establishing centres of oral research and history, vital to the archiving of a complex history that was so crudely manipulated by Soviet and post-Soviet regimes. Memory studies, on the other hand, and we have a representative here, I think one of the founders of memory studies in Georgia, has progressed much faster than oral history as a sub-discipline. There is a memory studies center of the Caucasus based at Ely State. They had an important conference in June of this year. And of course there is Sovlab that we've all heard about, the Soviet Past Research Laboratory project, which is quite a breakthrough in terms of using digital information or the internet to remember the Soviet past through photos and memorabilia of ordinary citizens. So it's very important. Memory studies and oral history, as all of the readings that we have shown, are closely interrelated. I'm not telling you anything new. Memory, by which I mean unofficial memories, that is both singular and collective, I think has played a very particular role in Georgian political life. Memory and the spoken word, I think, are in, and I hope my oral historian professionals would agree with me, are inevitably multivocal and pluralistic. And they were always a challenge, a major challenge to the Soviet government. Given the Soviet Union's hegemonic practice, personal memory, by which I mean, I guess, oral histories, were always confrontational at some level. And in the end, they were deeper and more persistent than the ideology of Marxism-Leninism. James Scott, I don't know whether any of you know James Scott, but in his work, he talks about subaltern cultures and the language of resistance, written transcripts, weapons of the weak, these sorts of ideas, has illuminated how memory and the language of ordinary citizens can very often subvert the grand schemes of states. Vladimir Dedijer, who was a Serb and Joseph Tito's right-hand man, once reflected, I'm going to quote him, quote, "Memory, as transmitted through folk songs, epic poems and oral traditions, has the power to destroy empires, as water has the strength to crack stones." In the 1980s, the Soviet state tried desperately to accommodate these popular memories, to adapt to these popular memories, when it was already apparent that the state was weak or weakening. But in the end, popular memories were victorious in that struggle with official memory. For Georgians, and this is where I think maybe there's something very specific maybe about the post-communist situation, personal memory was powerful, even often if it was inaccurate, because official history in the form of texts belonged to a very different world, belonged to a world of public hypocrisy, quite different from what was perceived as the private and moral superiority of families and private memories in those families. There was always a schism in Soviet Georgian society, and the family and the private memories that it passed on to its children were at the heart of that schism. There is a reason, frequently, why oral history is attracted to marginal and subaltern communities. Oral history can be interpreted, I guess, as a form of defiance, or at least a contradiction of the official narrative. And I think America referred to this, that some of its roots lie in the European left, which believed ordinary people were actually the real heroes of history, rather than the great men. All states, we know, shape official history, but in authoritarian states like the one that existed in Georgia in the Soviet period, these official narratives also create privatized memories. They stimulate privatized memories of resistance, which they also try to regulate. This was particularly true of Soviet communism, because it was characterized by the idea of a single truth, the absence of public space, and by the idea of pervasive control. And in my own work, I've come across this conflict, if you like, between official and private stories or histories. An early example for me was when I was working on a journal called Revoluții Smatiane, which it was published in the 1920s. I was working at the time on the First Republic. This was a journal that produced autobiographies and interviews of Bolsheviks, in some cases Mensheviks, about the revolution, the revolutionary period. And it was closed in the late 1920s, clearly because these sorts of stories were an intolerable threat to the sort of history that Stalin was trying to create for himself, particularly reflecting his own role in the revolutionary events of the Caucasus. Again, in the 1980s, we see the party struggling with newspapers, responding to a renewed outbreak at the time of personal memories about the 1930s and about autobiographies of political figures in the First Republic. I was a witness to those very intense battles in the public press. And then again, when we had the Georgian Neformalnia, or the informal groups and societies that emerged in the 1980s, we see these first civil organizations using unofficial history of the church, for example, or of the Soviet occupation in the 1920s, or this management of the environment, very effectively to secure their own popular legitimacy. So oral history had a very important purpose there in the political battle of the 1980s in Georgia. Of course, oral history does not always concern the marginal. One of the things that we want to do with our project, I think, is to look at the personal histories of elites in Georgia, political elites. I think this is a very important focus if you want to recount and understand Georgian history in the 1970s and 1980s. I cannot imagine that there is any other way to understand how the Communist Party worked in Georgia, and what the official ideology actually meant to elites without talking to them. If oral history is about filling in historical gaps and understanding, then I think we now have the opportunity to explore and talk to the people who were involved in those events. So in post-Soviet Georgia, the past became less of a challenge, I think, to the system and to system legitimacy, although I guess Abkhazians and South Ossetians might disagree with that statement. But through its practices, its rituals, its stories, the past, and again, this is nothing new to you because we often talk about it, presented significant obstacles to the new state and to state building. Beliefs, for example, about borders and where they lay, or about traditional values, or the role of the state, led to considerable resistance to institutional change, because it threatened to transform an old way of life. A new patriotic narrative emerged, of course, under Zviad Gamsakurian. And oral history was used in newspaper articles and on TV to demonstrate the evil nature of communism. Personal stories were used also to show the inevitable triumph of democracy. So oral history clearly can benefit us as, let's say, people who want to challenge traditional narratives, but also they can be very effectively manipulated by the governors, those who govern us. I believe in Georgia today that oral history can perform a number of vital functions for the history profession, as well as for the country as a whole. One of the issues Georgians have had to face, of course, is coming to terms with their own history and how people were involved, how your parents and your grandparents maybe were involved in the creation and the maintenance of the Soviet state. It's obviously a question of identity, but it's also a question of understanding the multiple motivations for collaboration, for cooperation and resistance. I think oral history can do that best. We cannot make assumptions, clearly, based on empirical evidence about why individuals and why communities behave the way they do. And oral history, with its mix of psychological probing and biographical detail, I think can give us real clues as to why people acted the way they did and why they didn't act when they may. Maybe they should have. I think one of the more difficult illusions that Georgians have had to overcome is that life under a market democracy will bring rapid improvement to their lives. The political abstractions of totalitarianism and democracy, which often serve as a framework for Georgia's historians and politicians, I think, clearly obscure the unevenness and the anxieties that come with political and economic transformation in Georgia. What oral history does better than textual history, I would argue, is to underline the ambivalent outcomes of social transformation. The Soviet system clearly was not monolithic. Certain groups, certain communities, certain professions did very well out of the Soviet system. I'm thinking of the citrus growers in Abkhazia, or the poets who were paid by the state to write their poetry, or by party officials in the 1970s who had privilege and stability, and by academics, right, who had very high status in the Soviet period. Václav Havel, of course, has talked about this in his own work. I'm thinking in particular of his essay, The Power and the Powerless, and has pointed out that totalitarianism, what Georgia experienced for most of the 20th century, was a participatory system. There were victors and there were beneficiaries as well as victims. In Georgia, the vast majority of the population muddled its way through difficult Soviet times, just as they did in other authoritarian systems. And that's a history that we need to know if we want an accurate picture of the actual experience of communism in Georgia. So in the post-communist era of market democracy, or at least the distorted forms of market democracy which Georgia experienced, many social and ethnic groups fared far worse than under communism. And they were very unhappy with the limited choices that this new national sovereignty presented them. Many teachers, for example, in Georgia, witnessed a deterioration in the schools and their own economic conditions. Corruption and crime grew in the 1990s, as did clientelism and elite privileges in the 2000s. I can remember on one occasion, as we all love to do if we're with visitors to Georgia, we talk to taxi drivers and think we're finding out something really important, right? But this was a very interesting conversation I had with a taxi driver, because I was trying to explain to him, at least you have independence, now things are going to get better. And he promptly turned around to me and said, well, what has independence done for me? Please tell me. Mm-hmm. So if the communist system obscured the unevenness of Soviet life, under Georgia's, let's say, neoliberal regimes, economic league tables, World Bank measurements of GDP and FDI, they also have failed to illuminate the reality experienced by my taxi driver. So oral history, I think, in Georgia, and not only in Georgia, has a demystifying role to play. One that challenges post-Soviet historical reinvention, as well as the claim of the Soviet period for a homogeneous history. So what oral history can do for us in Georgia, I believe, is provide a sense of the experience of both the Soviet and the post-Soviet eras. People's own stories clearly complicate the dominant narrative of resistance to control, which is one that you most commonly hear. Oral history clearly upends traditional narratives about Georgian 20th century history, which still dominate Georgian higher education. It recovers forgotten stories and highlights the devil in the details. We have no systematic interviews that I am aware of going back to the 1970s or even the 1980s. Rather, we rely on official documentation, newspaper reports, a small number of autobiographies, and Western analyses from afar. And that clearly is not enough if we're going to understand Georgian history over the last 30 years. So oral history then brings the ordinary Georgian citizen back into the mainstream. And it challenges simplistic interpretations of Georgia's brave struggle for independence. It opens up the lives of ordinary Georgians trying to survive totalitarianism or market capitalism. Oral history can help us examine the effect of changing economic, ideological and social conditions on family life, such as gender expectations. Public opinions clearly help us, but to understand how different members of the family change roles in their own homes clearly can best be done through oral history. Oral history could also help us analyze the impact of the manufacturing collapse in Rustavi, or investigate the inner life of political parties, or find out what democracy actually means in practice to rural Azerbaijanis. So oral histories get to the obscure areas between motivation, values and action, and they can help us understand why people act or do not act, and unpack dramatic events later characterized as turning points or as revolution. Oral testimonies, of course, too are reimagined or reconstructed, but this is not necessarily a weakness, but an additional mechanism for interpreting how history is perceived in people's own minds, and I think that point was already made. So to conclude, some thoughts as to why I think this particular project and oral history more generally will help us in Georgia, both as students of society and as citizens of Georgia. First, Georgia, so let me just name a few points. First, oral histories on the internet, national museums, TV, other digital formats are a very important way, I think, of actually engaging ordinary Georgians with their own history, particularly perhaps the younger generation. And that's very important. So these new methodologies and technologies that oral history can help can actually expand and make history a much more attractive thing to read or to experience. Currently, Georgian history is taught in the universities, as you know, in a rather dismal way, to put it conservatively, and clearly needs better public relations. Right? And I think oral history would be a way to do that by telling stories. Second, oral history is a mechanism for opening up the history profession itself, or any other profession, indeed, that uses oral history, in terms of connecting to new methodologies, ideas, and other specialists in the rest of the world. It challenges the pedagogical emphasis on collective entities such as classes, nations, and states, and focuses on the agency of ordinary people. Historians in Central and Eastern Europe have already begun to collect oral data on a national scale and to archive it for future generations. And in that respect, Georgia is still a very long way behind. Third, oral history perhaps is a way for Georgians to reconcile with their own painful past and to understand why people acted the way that they did, either as party officials in the 1970s or during Georgia's civil war in the 1980s. Fourth, oral history allows us to examine the Soviet period more honestly and to overcome the official demonization which obscures the complexities of the past. Finally, and that's again was another point that America made, oral history democratizes and pluralizes history. It presents the views of the many, and it challenges the great men theories and the adulation of heroes that, again, still dominate Georgian culture and Georgian curricula in universities. So the secretive Soviet past and the post-independence chaos of the 1990s, when so much documented history was destroyed or never written, are open, I think, particularly rich space for exploration by oral historians. And our project, I hope, will begin to recast Georgian history in different ways. Young Georgian scholars need to organize and promote oral history as a method of study and as a crucial instrument for cultural preservation. So I hope you will pursue this, and I hope you will recruit new allies, such as museums, public libraries, schools, media, and the government. And I think, again, listening to Mika's presentation, it's clear that very often the government itself is involved in promoting and exploring oral history projects. This is something that might be possible in Georgia. But these new avenues are clearly very important, and I'm hoping that you all will be able to start recording a past that may be able to teach us a few lessons, or teach future generations a few lessons about what not to repeat. So, thank you. So, questions? Sorry about the format. I didn't have time really to do my PowerPoint, which would be a bit more engaging, but there it is. That's what I have. So, any questions?
It's not a question. It's like about my feelings towards the oral history method. So it feels to me like it's like the investigation, what happened, or even what is happening in the backstage. So it makes all this even more interesting and exciting. This is not a front stage. This is all about the backstage, where the people are living their own lives and how they are experiencing or living, with the state policies. So policy can't address their actual lives, daily lives, and I think the only way to know about them, anything, the people, it's to go in the backstage.
Right. And I think this is something that oral history tends to emphasize, that it is about the experience. Not just of ordinary people, obviously there are projects that deal with elites too, but it's the actual experience of daily life, as you say, or of as eyewitnesses of historical events. That is important. It's not just about a recording, it's about what a person personally experiences and how they react to those experiences and what decisions they make as a consequence. Right? And that's the sort of thing you rarely can get to with a textual analysis. And I think that's why it's so important in Georgia. So I would agree with you on this. Trying to get to the issue of motivations and sort of psychological medicine, how people are reacting. So that's important.
You mentioned about the personal histories of elites in Georgia. And the elites which were forming the most important political events in Georgia in the 90s and 70s, they were part of it. But I think that there are a lot of gaps, I suppose. But also we still have some documents, like the interviews or documentaries or memoirs, in which they're telling how to say, in which they describe the events.
Right.
But so does those like materials, documentaries made, for example, about April, 9th of April, there are a lot of documentaries, a lot of movies or whatever, the personal stories and books. So will that be the complementary, how to say, for the oral history? Is both of them essential to form a real narrative, or do you think that we already have certain topics which are covered well?
No, I don't think. There are very few topics that are covered well, I think, over the last 40 years. Although those documentaries clearly are important and they contribute to our understanding. I mean, the only thing to keep in mind, I think, about some of those documentaries, for example, about 1989, is they're edited by journalists, right? And a journalist producing a documentary is going to do it for a particular reason. They have a targeted audience. It's a very different audience than oral historians, I guess, would aim to engage. The other thing I think about much of this documentation is that it's scattered. You don't know where it is. It's hard to find. I think, again, this is what Donald Ritchie seemed to be emphasizing in his book, that part of the oral history process is about systematizing what you are recording and making it accessible in an easy way, not only to other historians, but also to ordinary people. So, for example, he talks about the importance of clearly archiving, maybe putting, as many East Europeans have done, putting all this stuff in one place, right? So that you know where to go to find this material. And also indexing this stuff. So if you're watching a documentary, clearly you can wind it back and you can wind it forward and so on and so on. But you know what an oral historian would do, I guess, would be much more methodical about how it's recorded and how it's accessed. So they might, for example, index the material so you know where it is in a documentary film, or where the parts that you're particularly interested in are located. Right? I think that's a difference from the sort of materials that you're talking about.
For example, for sure, so we have some excerpts to watch and so on. So there was a booklet attached to it and a scenogram, so with all the people that were interviewed and so everything is, unfortunately this is in German.
This is show, right, you're talking about?
Sure, yeah. So the documentary show. So this is how it should be done, that it can also be used in the classroom, in the lecture, and so on, so for different purposes it makes it, because it is 560 minutes of material that are presented here.
Also, usually when I talk to the politicians or representatives of the polity, there are the sense of the parallel realities. They talk about the same things, but it's absolutely different. So in that sense, I think oral history will somehow help to, when you have a lot of quantity, when you have a lot of interviews, you'll somehow try to, move along with this both different narratives and find the truth. I
mean, I think one of the things that, and again, America pointed about this sort of counter-reaction to the idea that oral history was vague and undocumented in some sense. But if you go into the archives, you go into the Soviet Party archives here, very often, I was talking about this at lunchtime, you will find archival documents that will get you nowhere near the truth, right? I mean, even party officials talking to one another very often are talking in code. So you have to know the code, right? It's not as if they're being frank with one another and you can get to some real truth there. In some sense, I believe the only way to get to the truth is to understand what they're relationship was to the system of power, what their relationship was to the ideology that they were propagating, understanding what their relationship to it was. And that's, that's almost a psychological issue that we're exploring
what
there,
they
right?
wanted.
But it's in some sense far more real than reading a document in the archive that is framed in ideological terms. We know, certainly by the 1970s and 1980s, that many party elites simply didn't believe it anymore, right? And it's very interesting to get to that source, as to, well, if you didn't believe the ideology, what were you thinking when you were doing this? Right? And sometimes it was very, very fun.
Well, one remark is most interesting is how this thing of oral history is spreading already in museums. For instance, I was in Berlin and it was very interesting for me to see there. This you could go there, just switch. There were some TVs and you could switch, and there was a person who was talking about his personal experience and how he was somewhere and what he got through. And it's very interesting about this when you go and ask some person from the elite and he has some kind of other dimension. You can show him that, for instance, this person, you can go to museum and see what these people are talking about and what is this real oral history. And this is the main idea of it actually. It just in order for other people, for normal people, not only the researchers are interesting, because if I'm not a historian or sociologist, I won't go to archive and I won't see those documents. I'm just ordinary person who goes there and wants to see something. And it's very important. Actually, might be the idea of the museum that we have in Tbilisi, of occupation museum. Maybe it was the same idea of creating such kind of thing, but it didn't work out. It could be made. So, yeah.
No, I agree about that. Again, I think with museums, I was in Singapore recently, and I went to the National History Museum of Singapore, and it was a very interesting experience. Of course, Singapore is a dictatorship, more or less. A very comfortable one for most Singaporeans. Clean, comfortable, a very effective system of control, because everybody seems to be happy. They used oral history techniques. So they had, for example, the speech of Lee Kuan Yew when they declared independence from the Federation of Malaysia in 1965. And it was part of a narrative, clearly, that the museum was trying to project. Right? It was very interesting, rather like the Soviet Occupation Museum, right? So there were two sections to the National History Museum of Singapore. There was the pre-1965, and then there was the post-1965. And of course, the post-1965 was a story about progress, modernization, and happiness and harmony, right? Pre-1965 was very different. And I think, to some extent, you see that difference in the National Museum of Georgia, right, where you've got a museum that is displaying, craft from the second millennium BC, and then you're usually you're walking around these displays in a sort of very traditional way, absorbing this material. And then you go up to the Soviet Occupation Museum and you have a very different concept of what a museum should be doing.
Yeah.
And as soon as you step in that museum, you're actually in a classroom, because it's telling you a story that you need to know.
Yeah.
So I think that you're right, and I think this is very important in terms of getting people interested, is to connect with museums and schools and other places to get people relating their stories, right? But you've got to be you've got to have open curators, if you
Yeah.
like. You've got to have people who are relatively free of a particular narrative, right? Who could open things up. And I think very often that museums are actually instruments of
Yeah.
a particular narrative. Right?
We'll come back to that in 2 days.
Yeah.
I have some question. Maybe it's more methodological question, and maybe we will talk about it later. May I ask now?
I'm not very good on methodology. Maybe
No,
one
just came in my mind. Sure, we have this public discourse, official narrative, and some private stories. Okay, and if you want to, how to say, to have some idea what was this official narrative back in 90s, for example, or in 80s, can you, as a researcher, rely only on these oral histories of some private people, or you have to research from other sources as well?
Yeah. Make it one answer?
Well, the entire idea of official narratives is that they're widespread and supported by the state, so it would be very, very easy to find some additional sources on that. You can check textbooks from schools, but also, accounts on events that are
But
in
does
the
it make
newspaper
sense
and
to
whatever.
rely only on oral histories of ordinary people?
I wouldn't do that for official narratives because there are so many ways to check them, and it will not cost you a lot of time to check them.
As a historian, you should always attempt to get a maximum of sources from a maximum of different perspectives on your topic. So to really it's like a Scheinwerfer, also like throwing light into the different edges and corners. So to get spotlight, yeah. So really to get a comprehensive overview about the roles, the interests of different actors that are there. So I would answer to your question, no, you need more. Oral history is a good complement really to official sources that you might find in the party archive. So then you see what the party intended to do to curb corruption. And in oral history you will find how there were strategies developed to undermine this, because this was a way how to improve your living conditions. So Siberia of the South. Does anybody from the Georgians know where it was?
Siberia?
Siberia of the South.
The Caucasus.
Sorry?
The Caucasus.
Yes, but I'm talking of place. It's
Siberia?
sorry?
No, Siberia of the South.
Khashuri. You know that because this was a place where a lot of Jews who went in the 70s, and they managed to bring how was it? So jeans and such consumer retail products to Georgia, and then a lot of Georgians went there to purchase it. So you know this. So it means something was transmitted to you, because this is not part. So I did not find it in any of the official history textbooks and so on, but it is part of a collective memory.
Can I ask a question? What's wrong about this name? Why Siberia? If this was a kind of a trade center of the whole country.
Have you been to History?
Probably it's a climate, I don't know, but because it was always.
This was the periphery of the Russian Empire. That was the alternate periphery.
But Siberia was perceived like it was a prison,
Siberia was also
so it was
an
like
alternate
for
periphery.
outcasts, right? So
Kashuri
apparently was the very center of Georgian like city life and trade center. So why Siberia? I don't
It
know.
was not only
Are you from Kashuri?
Kashuri was one of the examples. It was Caucasus, but because it was the ultimate border.
Just board. Okay, I see.
I think what comes out of this, in many ways, Tampa, right? Yeah, is that you don't use the word rely. Right? You maybe don't use the word rely. You don't rely on anything, right?
Yeah.
You you look skeptically at every source that you use. I'm not being cynical about it. I don't know whether you've ever seen the film Rashomon or
Oh yeah.
right?
Russia?
Akira
Rashomon.
Kurosawa.
Kurosawa's film in which
We can watch that movie actually.
okay, in which a murder takes place.
That is the most
but there
best-
are different, different
best
witnesses
movie
to
ever.
this murder, and they all tell their different stories,
Mhm.
right? I guess that's the
Rashomon,
way.
it's a movie.
It's a
Rashomon.
movie,
That's
Japanese
Ah,
that is
Rashomon.
based
Oh,
on
okay.
Right,
very
sorry,
famous.
yeah.
We can read the
book.
story.
There's also a wonderful English writer, I might tell you, Lawrence Durrell, who wrote a very interesting, well, I think it was more than a trilogy, called, yeah, it was Alexander Quartet, that was it called, Alexandria Quartet, which was about life in Alexandria in Egypt. But each novel that he wrote was told from the point of view of a different person. And you get this very different understanding of events that took place among these four people. And I think that's in some ways,
Yeah, and
You
the
know, what-
methodological approach for historians would be multi-perspectivity.
that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, multi-perspectivity is the approach that is crucial here. And we were discussing values yesterday. Multi-perspectivity is a must. Yeah? So not just to have a view from one source or from one perspective only.
I have a question. Talking about politics, well, if oral history as a method is based on the agency of the ordinary people,
Yeah.
would it be correct to say that the very nature of this method is noticed?
No, I don't think so, not necessarily. I think that was certainly one of the motivations, right? It's this idea that that history is a shared enterprise by everyone. I can't remember, I think I read in Donald Ritchie's book, some famous old historian said, what people say is history. I mean, it was a very sort of dramatic contrast with the idea that history is made by elites. Right? So I don't think it's always left wing, but I think that in some sense, of course, what happened in Georgia was right wing in the sense that it was challenging a left wing ideology of problems. Right? And this was one of the points I think I was trying to make in the paper that really what oral history is in Georgia at least is trying to do is to prevent this homogeneous view of the Soviet past as one of either collaboration or resistance. Of course, it was in most cases somewhere in the middle. Right? And I think again it's something true of the post-Soviet period, right? That oral history becomes political because it does challenge the orthodoxy, whatever that is, right? So I think in some sense you might not say it's left-wing, but you might say it's subversive in some way, or on the other hand, as I pointed out, sometimes elites will also use oral history to make their case. So.
You might draw a parallel with postmodernism, which began from post-leftists to stand up for the subaltern and for the unrepresented. And then it becomes very convenient for the Putinists and the climate change deniers, the Holocaust deniers, using the same.
Yeah, exactly.
My question to you, to the Georgians, did you read something like this?
Yes.
Yeah, did you read also the fourth volume on the 20th century?
No. Oh, no.
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 Sometimes even you didn't.
No, I didn't. I just jumped in.
Okay, because this is something. Well, if you read, then you will see. So what is in there and what is not in there. Yeah. But I will talk about this tomorrow. So I won't not give the point.
I have a question. If there is any difference between life story interviews and oral history methodology, or just the same?
Life history is one way in which you can conduct an oral history, but you can also do an oral history on something specific. It's not so that every oral historian will always conduct life history, because you might have a specific question about a specific event that you're asking people about without being interested in.
But life story is too general, you mean?
No, I mean there are a lot of people who do life histories, but in life histories you ask about a person's entire life, from birth until now. Whereas this is not always something you want to do, it depends on the project. So,
I think, again, reading from the one book that I did read over this, Tom Richard, what he points out is sometimes, in the interview process, even if you're just talking to someone about a specific event, which is what we might be doing with our project, maybe looking at 1989 or something like that, and asking witnesses, what did you experience then? That very often you have to contextualize that. You have to understand who the witness is, what they experienced, how that affected their interpretation of what happened in 1989, right? So that very often the difference between a life history and a focus on a particular event becomes blurred and interconnected, so that life history still remains an important part of understanding why that person is saying the things that they are. And very often, again as I understand it, if you're asking an eyewitness, that very often it will spill over into a life history that then picks up information that you should not ignore, even though you're focusing on something very specific, right? Because it's all fascinating and interesting material for the oral historian and the scholarly researcher, right? Even though that's maybe not what you were aiming at.
Even want to understand how he or she, or why he or she views the event, or the things like she does. First and foremost, I have to know her and him as a person.
I don't. I mean,
Okay.
I would guess yes and no. I guess yes and no. I mean, you can imagine somebody who would witness 1956, March 1956, might look at 1989 in a different way than somebody who would not. I mean, so those are important facts. Those are important issues that I think you need to know.
however, checking somebody's background is not the same as doing a life history, in which case you will really start at the beginning, ask somebody about his parents, where they come from. So this is really something which is a method in itself, and that is not something you will always use.
Sure, I understand that, yeah. But I think that sometimes, you can't stop yourself wandering from a specific...
In any interview, the more information you get, the better.
Right.
But that's it.
Right.
My Georgian teacher, in 1988, when I was here for the first time, so Anna Abuladze, Georgian language chair, so modern Georgian language at Tbilisi State University. When this protest in 1989, April 9th, was the climax, but it started already in 1988, and she already was afraid of that this could end up in violence, like as it was in 1956. She remembered it, and she was afraid of that, and she was warning her students not to go there. Yeah? So it's totally right.
I have a question. This is also, I think, methodological, but when you have two different dimensions on the same topic, like people are saying two opposite things, and then if you're just putting these interviews out for open interpretation, I guess that's okay, but if you're doing your own analysis for own research, then you're kind of adding your own objective side of it, because this is not like mathematics to put average of the story. One of them might be true, none of them be true, and somehow you have to analyze this, and I'm interested where this middle ground, where it's fine.
This is what I plan to speak about.
Okay, good. But that's a very good question. I mean, do you want to answer that?
Well, if somebody is going to answer that, then I'm just going to leave it.
All right. So your answer is postponed.
Yeah.
was wondering how important it is to be a native speaker or a cultural insider in order to be able to decipher linguistic or cultural codes easily.
Okay, I think it's very important that you know a language well. Well enough also to pick out, for instance, what's a colloquial expression, what something ought to say, know enough about the specific context, and if somebody is starting to understand the joke, or if if something is set rude and these kind of things. So you should speak a language well, obviously. However, we were talking about this during lunch earlier at the table. In the project I do, I was explaining that I think that the only reason that I was allowed the access that I have to the people I interviewed is because I'm not a German. I had showed up being a German, wanting to ask former Stasi members about their lives. Well, chances are very high indeed that they would have said no. So sometimes it might actually be an advantage to be an outsider. However, in any case, then you need to be very well prepared, because you still need to have enough knowledge of the background to be able to do your interviews well. But you can prepare that.
Good question. All right. Any more questions? We can follow up after this informally after the session.